Martell are no longer even on speaking terms in a meaningful way, and that silence still weighs heavily. When they got married, she never imagined their relationship would reach a point where basic communication would completely break down. If anything, she once believed they would be the couple renewing vows, not living entirely separate lives. For a long time, Melody stayed calm in public despite everything. Some people even felt she stayed quiet for too long, handling interviews, awkward encounters, and online comments with controlled patience. But over time, that calmness began to look more like pressure she was carrying silently. People kept expecting her to eventually break her silence or react strongly, and now it seems that moment may have finally come. According to those close to the situation, Martell crossed boundaries that Melody was no longer willing to accept. The surprising part is not just what happened, but that Melody responded in a way the public has never seen from her before, without softness, without filtering, and without protecting the image of peace she once tried to maintain. Their history has been deeply public and painful, marked by betrayal, cheating, emotional damage, and the collapse of what once looked like a strong marriage. Many people believed the divorce would bring closure, but instead it became the start of a longer and more complicated conflict. Even after separation, tension never really disappeared. Every attempt at co-parenting or moving forward seemed to be interrupted by new issues, whether through interviews, social media posts, or public statements that brought old wounds back into focus. While Melody tried to rise above it and rebuild her life through business, parenting, and personal growth, the situation around Martell often followed her progress. Over time, a pattern became noticeable. As Melody advanced in her career and built a stronger independent identity, controversy involving Martell seemed to reappear. This made it harder for her to fully detach from the past, especially as her professional life expanded beyond reality television into business partnerships and brand opportunities where reputation is extremely important. Reports and rumors even suggested she wanted more distance from him behind the scenes to protect her career and peace of mind. Things reportedly escalated when an incident allegedly interfered with one of her professional opportunities, shifting the situation from personal conflict to something that affected her livelihood. After that, people noticed a clear change in Melody's energy. She became more reserved, more serious, and far less emotional in her public appearances. Instead of trying to maintain balance, she started focusing more on boundaries and protection. At one point, she reportedly described Martell as a liability, a word that reflected a major shift in how she viewed the situation. It was no longer just about their past relationship. It was about risk, stability, and her future. That statement divided public opinion, but what stood out most was not anger in her tone, but clarity. Meanwhile, Martell's responses online only intensified public attention. His reactions were seen as defensive and emotional, which fueled more discussion and led fans to revisit old footage of their relationship with a new perspective. Moments that were once overlooked now appeared more serious in hindsight, changing how people interpreted their past dynamic. Even behind the scenes, there were claims that tensions were affecting production and making interactions more difficult. At the same time, Melody's public image continued shifting in a different direction. She became more associated with growth, independence, and emotional strength. Instead of being defined by her past relationship, she was increasingly seen as someone who rebuilt her life from a painful situation and created something stable on her own. This contrast between their paths only widened the emotional distance between them. Now, it seems clear that Melody has entered a phase focused entirely on protection and forward movement. She is no longer operating from a place of trying to fix the past or maintain fragile peace. Instead, her actions reflect someone prioritizing her career, her peace of mind, and her future stability. What once looked like ongoing emotional conflict now appears more like final separation in every sense. And for her, that may be the real shift, not reacting to the past anymore, but fully stepping away from it. As this distance continues to grow, the biggest change is not just what is being said publicly, but what is no longer being said at all. There is a noticeable shift from reaction to silence, from explanation to restraint. Melody no longer seems interested in defending every narrative or responding to every comment connected to the past. Instead, she appears more focused on controlling access to her life and limiting anything that pulls her back into old conflict. That kind of silence is often misunderstood, but in reality it usually signals emotional closure rather than avoidance. At the same time, the public attention around their situation has not slowed down. Every small update, every indirect post, and every resurfaced clip continues to be analyzed and discussed. But the difference now is that the story no longer feels balanced between two perspectives. Instead, it feels like one person is moving forward while the other is still entangled in the aftermath. That imbalance has shaped how audiences interpret everything, making Melody's growth look even more defined in contrast. For Martell, the ongoing attention has only added pressure. His responses, whether intentional or emotional, tend to reignite discussion rather than calm it. And as more time passes, old patterns are being reevaluated by viewers who now see earlier moments in a different light. What once seemed like typical relationship conflict is now being viewed through a more critical lens, which only deepens the divide in public opinion. Meanwhile, Melody's focus continues to shift further away from the past. Her actions suggest someone who is not waiting for resolution anymore, but instead building stability that does not depend on it. She is no longer operating in the space of trying to be understood by everyone involved in the history. Instead, she is prioritizing her own direction, her career growth, and the environment she wants for herself and her children. In many ways, this stage represents the final emotional separation that often takes longer than the legal one. Even after divorce, emotional ties, public narratives, and shared history can keep people connected in unhealthy ways. But what is becoming clear now is that those ties are loosening. The emotional weight that once surrounded every interaction is slowly being replaced by distance and structure. And while the public will likely continue to follow every development, the real shift has already happened. The story is no longer about what went wrong between them, it is about what happens when one person stops revisiting it altogether. For Melody, that seems to be exactly where she is headed. Not toward conflict, not toward closure discussions, but toward a life where the past no longer has permission to interrupt the present. What makes this stage even more significant is how it changes the way both of them exist in the public eye. The relationship is no longer the center of attention in the same emotional way it once was, but instead a reference point that people keep revisiting to understand their current behavior. Every new comment, interview, or post is now filtered through the history they share, which means even unrelated actions are often tied back to their past. That kind of long shadow makes it difficult for either person to fully escape the narrative, even when they are no longer directly engaging with each other. For Melody, this shift has meant learning how to operate without constant emotional interruption. Instead of reacting to every situation involving Martell, she appears more selective, choosing when to speak and when to stay silent. That selectiveness is not about avoidance, but about control, deciding what deserves her energy and what no longer does. Over time, this approach naturally reduces emotional exposure, allowing her to focus on areas of life that are not tied to conflict or public comparison. At the same time, the audience perception of both individuals continues to evolve. People are no longer just reacting to present moments, but also reinterpreting past events with new understanding. This creates a kind of ongoing reevaluation, where earlier actions are constantly being reassessed through the lens of what is known now. As a result, the narrative around their relationship has become less about a single breakup and more about a long process of emotional separation that unfolded publicly over time. Despite all of this attention, what stands out most is the difference in direction. Melody's path increasingly reflects independence and structure, while the connection to past conflict becomes weaker with each passing moment. Even when the public brings up old issues, her responses or lack of response suggest that she is no longer emotionally anchored to them. That shift is subtle but powerful because it shows change not through statements, but through behavior. Martell, on the other hand, remains more visibly tied to the ongoing conversation, whether intentionally or through reaction. And that contrast continues to shape how audiences view both of them. In situations like this, perception often becomes reality for the public, and the way each person handles attention plays a major role in how their story is understood. Ultimately, what is unfolding is not just a breakup story anymore, but a long transition from connection to complete separation in every meaningful sense. The emotional chapter that once defined them is slowly being replaced by individual identity, personal direction, and separate futures. And while the history between them will always exist, it no longer defines the present in the same way it once did. For Melody especially, the direction is clear: less reaction, more focus, and a continued step away from anything that reopens old wounds. What remains is not conflict, but distance, and with that distance comes a different kind of stability, one built not on fixing the past, but on finally leaving it where it belongs. As this new phase continues, what becomes even more noticeable is how differently both of them now exist in their own separate worlds. The shared identity they once had as a couple has slowly dissolved into two completely independent narratives. There is no longer a joint storyline moving forward, only two individual paths that occasionally overlap through history, memory, and public discussion. And even those overlaps now feel more like echoes of the past rather than something still actively unfolding. For Melody, this separation has created space that she seems to be using very intentionally. Instead of being pulled into repeated cycles of explanation or reaction, she appears more grounded in building consistency in her own life. That includes protecting her time, her work, and her emotional environment from anything that could disrupt her progress. Over time, that kind of discipline naturally reshapes how a person is perceived, because it shows a shift from surviving situations to actively designing a life beyond them. At the same time, the public's fascination with their history has not completely faded, but it has changed in tone. People are no longer just reacting to shock or drama, they're analyzing patterns, timelines, and emotional behavior with more distance than before. That shift means the story is no longer fueled by immediate conflict, but by reflection on everything that has already happened. And in that reflection, Melody's growth stands out even more clearly. Martell's presence in the conversation, meanwhile, continues to be tied to that same past, which makes it harder for the narrative around him to evolve in a different direction. Whenever attention returns to him, it often circles back to the same themes, the same history, and the same unresolved tension. That repetition keeps the old storyline alive in public memory, even as time moves forward. But what is most significant now is that neither approval nor criticism seems to shift Melody's direction anymore. That is often the final stage of emotional separation, when outside noise stops influencing internal decisions. At that point, choices are no longer made in response to another person, but in alignment with personal stability and long-term goals. And that is where her focus appears to be rooted now. In many ways, this stage is not about conflict at all anymore. It is about completion. Not the kind that comes from public statements or dramatic closure, but the quieter kind that happens when someone simply stops returning to what once caused them pain. The absence of engagement becomes its own form of resolution. And so, what remains is distance, clear, consistent, and no longer negotiable. A distance that doesn't need to be explained or defended, because it is reflected in behavior, priorities, and direction. For Melody, that distance has become a boundary, and that boundary has become stability. And in that stability, the past slowly loses its ability to interrupt what comes next. At this point, the most important change is not what either of them says publicly, but how little emotional reaction remains attached to those words. The story that once lived in constant back and forth energy now feels like it has settled into stillness on one side and repetition on the other. That contrast has quietly reshaped how the public understands their journey, because silence and consistency often speak louder than ongoing responses. For Melody, that stillness has become a form of protection rather than withdrawal. It allows her to operate without constantly revisiting moments that once drained her emotionally. Instead of being pulled into old cycles, She is building routines and decisions that are disconnected from past conflict. That separation creates space for clarity, where choices are made based on direction rather than reaction. Even in how she is perceived, there is a noticeable shift. She is no longer primarily framed through the lens of what she endured, but increasingly through what she has built after it. That distinction matters because it changes the narrative from survival to evolution. And in public spaces where narratives often define identity, that evolution becomes significant. Meanwhile,